Hey everyone, you are listening to the 7th episode in the ClassofHC 2016 Election Clapback podcast. It's a series that was inspired by a good book that I read this summer, and a series that's been provoked by the foolishness that we have all seen in this year's presidential election campaign. I am Deji, curator of the Class of Hope and Change documentary. You can find out more information about that project at ClassofHC.com. Last time, we talked about the time when America was great for some of us, the 1950s and early 60s. This time, we're talking about a time when life in America fell off a little bit, the 1970s. For those of you listening for the first time, thanks for checking out the series. This book was inspired, like I said, by a really good book that I read this summer called Economix, Economix, by Michael Goodwin and Dan Burr. It's a comic book version of American history with a focus on our economic history. Really does an incredible job of explaining with cartoon pictures how we started with the system that we have, and walks through a lot of important moments in the recent history of this country, almost the full history of this country, that led to kind of the situation we're in now. So I don't know the authors personally. I'm not getting paid to plug their book, but this book was the inspiration for this project, and definitely believe in giving credit where it's due. So the link to the book is in the bio. Check it out if you are interested. Think it'll be worth your time. We pick up in the part of the book that deals with the 1970s. In 1970, the U.S. oil production was at its highest level in history. Actually, until just a few years ago, 1970 was the highest year of oil production within the U.S. ever. If you Google a term called peak oil, you will see that that was a concern for a lot of people, thinking that we will never get back to producing what we produced in 1970, and we keep having more people, and we keep building more machines, and people drive more cars. We're going to run out of oil and all this other stuff. So until very recently, that was a very, very serious concern. So Google the term peak oil. Definitely you'll see how much of a big deal it was until just very recently when the U.S. started producing a lot more oil. So the book explains that throughout the first half of the 20th century, oil fields in the Mideast were run by Western oil companies, either oil companies in America or in Europe. And they ran those companies and paid like little royalty payments to the governments and to the people of the countries where the oil fields actually were. So in 1960, those countries formed an organization called OPEC, Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. Very big deal if you are not familiar with this organization. Most of the times that you, until very recently again, when the U.S. started producing oil, anytime oil prices jumped up or gas prices got expensive or your heating oil got expensive, 9 times out of 10, something had to do with OPEC, this organization of the countries that had the oil fields in the Middle East that used to be run by Western governments, but then they got mad that they weren't getting their money from all their oil, and they formed their own organization. So, but very, very important to understand how that organization came to be. So the book explains that many of the nations in the OPEC organization were Arab nations. So in 1973, very, very big event happened in the Middle East called the October War, also called the Arab-Israeli War, also called the Yom Kippur War, the Ramadan War. So essentially in 1973, Israel went to war with Egypt and Syria and a whole bunch of countries in the Gulf. So when America took Israel's side, those countries, remember, in OPEC were primarily Arab nations, so they got upset and they cut off the oil supply to the U.S. Remember, at the time, 1970 was the highest amount of oil that the U.S. had produced. So by 1973, we were producing less oil. And then this war starts. We take Israel's side. The OPEC nations are angry. So they say, we're cutting down the oil, cutting off the oil to you, actually. So the book does a really good job of showing the global impact of what happens when oil prices go up, when there's less oil available to purchase. So it's not just about not having enough gas for your car or heating oil, but because by 1970s and obviously through today, so much of our food is gathered and grown and shipped by machines that run on gas and oil and diesel and need all sorts of fuel and things. So anytime the oil price jumps, that makes it more expensive to run those machines, which makes it more expensive to get food, which means you pay more for food, which means people who do not have money have no food. Very, very big deal anytime oil prices go up. And the book does a good job of showing like the global impact on places that were outside of the war region and outside of kind of the disagreement that the U.S. and OPEC were having. Also in the 1970s, the book talks about how there was also a change in how big businesses operated. Remember last episode, we talked about all the different gains that were accruing to U.S. workers because of all the fights and struggles and victories that had happened in the early part of the 1900s. So by the middle of the 1970s, you have a serious oil crisis in America. This obviously leads to long gas lines, and many people were alive then and can speak to that and the situation that was going on in this country at the time. On top of it, the book talks about a change in how big businesses operated. So after World War II, corporations, the largest ones anyway, were expanding and were involved in selling different types of products. They're involved in many different industries. So you see a rise of what we call conglomerates, companies that do more than one thing, and company that owns a TV station but also makes industrial parts and also makes engines and does all these other things. It makes light bulbs, right? Thinking of General Electric as an example. So you have companies that do all these different things. So they needed different kinds of people to run their business because their business was so complicated. At this time, you also see the rise of management consultants, kind of people we would think of as MBAs today. And the book talks also about how bad management really hurt large corporations in America during the 70s. So, for example, the CEO of Ford during the 70s, in one tragic situation, told the Ford designers to build a car that weighed less than 2,000 pounds, build it for $2,000, and told them how quickly they should make it. And so that's not exactly how you should design cars. And if you've never heard of this case, here's what happened.
In 1971, Ford Motor Company started to manufacture the Pinto. As early as 1972, Ford knew that the car's gas tank could rupture if it was rear-ended and ignite a deadly fire. As a result of this faulty design, 27 people were killed in accidents that Ford could have prevented.
The Ford Motor Company knew that people would die, knew that the product was defective, but calculated it would be less expensive to just compensate the families of the people who were killed and injured and to continue producing the defective Pinto.
A Ford Motor Company memo concluded that the cost of redesigning the Pinto to be safe would far exceed the expense of paying the victims of fatal Pinto accidents $200,000 per human life.
The jury said this isn't right, and they socked Ford with over $100 million in punitive damages. It sent not only a message to Ford, that was a worldwide shock about what the court system can do and what is not acceptable as a business practice.
So definitely Google the Ford Pinto case if you want more information about that tragic situation. But I think a couple things are important in this election clapback moment. Notice that there was a jury trial and a verdict. And one of the questions we always have to ask ourselves is what, again, is the relationship between large businesses and the citizens? And so businesses, as we've talked about, go back to episode 2 if you haven't listened to that before, the role of corporations and what their responsibility is and what their goals are, and what happens when those goals don't match with the goals that we say that we value as a society, and what are the rules that should be in place. Should there be any rules in place? Some people say no, some people say there should be rules. What do you think? That's an important question that we have to answer. What happens when someone thinks it's cheaper to pay for human life than it is to make a product safe? All right, we have examples like that very much so in our times now. In addition to that, we also had bad management happening in other industries. An example the book gives is the Penn Central Railroad, which collapsed and went out of business and is the reason that we have Amtrak today, which is the government running our national railroad passenger system. We again see that so many of the things that we talk about, so many of the things that you may have thought of as an issue today have been around now for 40 years. And then again, the question is, how is that possible? So we had these troubles in the railroads, had these troubles in Detroit with our American car manufacturers, And remember, we go back to episode 1, Capitalism, the Free Market, and Adam Smith's ideas about how an economy works. While these things were happening and certain American industries were getting weaker, there were other people around the globe that were starting to catch up to us. One example being the Japanese car manufacturers. A critical concept that the book talks about is that since the Japanese car manufacturers were making increasing money from selling cars in the US, one issue that arose was the fact that they didn't buy as much from us as they sold to us. So this is called a trade deficit, and it's a large part of what you hear in the back and forth in today's election campaign. So here's the way it works. Let's say that I buy a lot of stuff from you. That allows you to make money, right? And you have money to live, you have money to buy equipment, you have money to build factories, you have money to hire the people in your community. But if you don't buy as much from me, then I don't have as much money to hire people or build factories or get equipment or do anything to help my own economic situation. And also, with the extra money that you have and the extra money that I need, now I have to start selling stuff in my house to make up for the difference. Because remember, you didn't buy as much from me as I bought from you. So I have to make up the difference somehow. So I start looking around my house and maybe I can start to sell some things. This is exactly what started happening in America. And so you have businesses from different parts of the world that were selling more stuff to us than they bought from us. So they had extra money to spend because they didn't need as much. They didn't buy as much from us in the first place. So they had extra money to spend. We didn't have enough money. So we start selling stuff like real estate. Many of the sort of buildings and things like that start being bought by different people in different countries, which is good for people. The book explains if you own that building, that's great. But one of the things that does is begins the rise of real estate being expensive, right? Particularly in popular cities. Sound familiar? So you have wealthy people who have money to spend from other places. They buy up the property that they like in popular cities that they like, which makes it more expensive for people who are trying to start businesses and live in those cities, which pushes them further out. And if that doesn't sound like what we're doing right now in this country, then you might need to travel around a little bit more. So this was the 1970s, ladies and gentlemen, meaning that the issues that are driving this year's election, many of the things that I mentioned are the same exact things that are happening today. Again, the election clapback question is, how is this possible? And in the next few weeks that we have left, what are the kind of answers you would like to see? What are the kinds of topics you would like to make sure are on the table and discussed when people come and they ask you to clap for them and vote for them and cheer for them? If we've been dealing with this stuff for 40 years, what's the next step for us? And also, as I've done for the past few episodes, like to broaden the discussion and include the voices of people who were eyewitnesses during this time. So important that we have in this election clapback moment a full and broad and complete sense of where America has been. And there are so many voices, so many people who are writing and thinking and creating and engaged in those moments. And we often don't hear about them when history gets told to us, particularly on television. And so I offer some quotes from some people who were prominent during this time. And there are only a few. There were many, many more people from many different walks of life. If you have some that you feel like need to be added to the discussion about this moment in American history, please let us know. We're at ClassofHC on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. You can also email us at ClassofHC@gmail.com. We definitely love to hear about the people who've mattered to you and the books you've read and the people who influenced you, particularly from this period of the 1970s, who can help us to understand in a more complete way exactly what was going on at that time and help us have a better sense of how to move forward. A few quotes from people who were around during this time when America kind of wasn't so great. Number 1, quote, "When I was a kid, we were in love with America. As early as I can remember, there was a civics class in my public school, and I was in love with those things that guaranteed freedom before I learned that there were people who hated me because I was Jewish. I had a Bill of Rights and a Constitution, those words out of the Declaration that protected me. And I knew about that because we had civics in class. We don't have that much in the country anymore. So before World War II or shortly after, we were in love with America because we understood what it was about, and that's what we were in love with. I believe everybody's patriotic today. Everybody loves America, but I don't need their flag plans to prove it. I'd like to go back to civics lessons. End quote. Norman Lear. Number 2. Quote, childhood remembrances are always a drag if you're black. You always remember things like living in Woodlawn with no inside toilet, and if you become famous or something, they never talk about how happy you were to have your mother all to yourself and how good the water felt when you got your bath from one of those big tubs that folk in Chicago barbecue in. And somehow when you talk about home, it never gets across how much you understood their feelings as the family attended meetings about Hollydale. And even though you remember, your biographers never understand your father's pain as he sells his stock and another dream goes. And though you're poor, it isn't poverty that concerns you. And though they fought a lot, it isn't your father's drinking that makes any difference, but only that everybody is together, and you and your sister have happy birthdays and very good Christmases. And I really hope no white person ever has to write about me, because they never understand black love is black wealth, and they'll probably talk about my hard childhood, and never understand that all the while I was quite happy. End quote. A poem called Nikki Rosa by Nikki Giovanni. Number 3. I knew there was a way to blend records together, but I didn't know how to. This was haunting me when I was in my teens. In my frustration, I decided to start experimenting with electronics. I tested the torque factor on different turntables. I had to figure needles out. End quote. Grandmaster Flash. Number 4. Students do not need to be labeled or measured any more than they are. They don't need more federal funds, grants, and gimmicks. What they need from us is common sense, dedication, and bright, energetic teachers who believe that all children are achievers and who take personally the failure of any one child. End quote. Marva Collins. Number 5. Last one. Quote, I believe the ability to think is blessed. If you can think about a situation, you can deal with it. The big struggle is to keep your head clear enough to think. End quote. Richard Pryor. And I think that's a good note to end this episode on. It's the work of this Election Clapback project that we are trying to clear our heads enough to think and trying to find a way to think in what has been a less than clear election. Definitely reach out to us on social media. We're at ClassofHC on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook. Use the hashtag Election Clapback so that we can see your comments. Trying to create another space where people of goodwill and good sense can bring the best ideas from this country forward so that at least we go into this next year with more American people knowing what can work, what is working, what could work, and getting away from much of the foolishness that we are seeing now. You can also email us at ClassofHC@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Have a great one.